All right, so I want to combine the idea of extreme first passage times with rare events. Um, I've been working on this specific project for a while now. Some of my collaborators, Scott McKinley at Tulane, Alan Lindsay at Notre Dame, and Eric Foxall at UBC Okanagan, um, which is a much prettier branch of UBC that's in the mountains near lots of wineries. So if you ever have a chance to go there, I highly recommend it. Um, so the problem is as follows, and we've seen this, of course, many times now. I'm going to assume I have like a simple Langevin equation like this. It can be in any dimensions. Um, and there's some first passage time, and I'm going to define it simply as like the distance from the origin being less than or equal to L. Um, and I'm going to look at the maximum of these first passage times. So this is obviously related to the one that we've probably seen a little bit more, which is the minimum of these first passage times. So there's a small difference there. And then I've done some previous work with James McLaurin on the minimum, a very similar problem, but where we were looking at the minimum of these first passage times. So this is a little bit newer work. But I'm actually not going to really look or study the statistics of this first passage time. So what is it exactly that I am going to do? Well, hopefully I can describe that. Okay, so I'm looking at a problem I'm calling like a survivor problem. That's a working title. I don't know. That's an overused word. I really hate it when people use overused, overworked words in to name their stuff. But I hope you see like why I named it like. So the setup is I'm going to assume like a radially symmetric drift towards the origin, okay? And that there's some sphere around the origin with radius L, which I'm going to call the hot lava, right? So I'm looking at a process that starts out here somewhere, right? And you know the drift is going to carry it towards the hot lava, and that's when the process stops. Okay, so okay, so far that's a pretty boring process. I'll grant you that. But what I really want to study is uh, uh, processes that take a really long time to do this. Okay, so they're surviving a lot longer than the other identical processes, and I'm asking the question, how do they survive for a really long time, right? So I want to look at three special cases for this drift that points towards the origin. That depends on the distance from the origin. One is constant drift towards the origin. One is Ornstein-Uhlenbeck. So the farther away we get, the bigger the drift gets linearly with R. And then one that's what I'll just call 1 over R drift. So the drift gets weaker as you get further away.
Is little f the same as big F?
Oh, sorry. Let me redo that. So big F, just so I'm just assuming that it points towards the origin. Okay. So in all these, I'm going to assume that little f is greater than 0 everywhere. It's three special cases. So why do I have three cases? Because this is the case I want. I want Ornstein-Uhlenbeck, but these are the ones I can actually solve, right? But I can get some insight, and I have made some progress on the Ornstein-Uhlenbeck case. All right. So if I want to, build like maybe a physical picture to put in your mind about what I mean by this process. I mean, picture like one of those mosquito lamps, right? There's a party, there's a mosquito lamp. The light attracts the mosquitoes to come, and then as soon as they hit the lamp, zap, right? They're dead. So you go to this party and you release a huge number of mosquitoes, right? Somewhere away from the lamp. And the party's ruined, whatever, but you wait around for the last mosquito to hit the bzzz, and you ask the question, well, where did the mosquito go? The rest of the mosquitoes were like sort of attracted. It flew more or less straight into the lamp. But noise alone caused one of them to survive for a really long time. But how does that work? So when I set this problem up, I mean, I didn't know the answer. So it sort of made intuitive sense that maybe it would hover near the hot lava, right? But stay some distance away from it, right? Because the fluctuations that carry it farther and farther away are more increasingly improbable, right? but you don't want to be too close to lava because then it becomes more probable that you'll have a fluctuation that carries you into the hot lava. Okay. So I don't know what the answer, well, I didn't know what the answer was going in, and it's always nice. So there's a more physically relevant example related to biology here, and that is epigenetic memory and drug resistance. So this could be antibiotic resistance or fungicide resistance. So we're talking about time scale of the reproduction or the division time scale. And so if your gene expression circuit has some protein product X, and we just take a simple model for that, say like an Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process, and then you're looking for you assume that you have a situation where the protein concentration has to be sufficiently high for the organism to survive. Most of the cells are in this typical zone, and they're the ones that are going to die, but some of them are going to survive, right? So this would be kind of like a mechanism for non-genetic resistance. Okay, so this is my colleague, by the way, Daniel Charlebois, in the physics department at the University of Alberta. So that's another inspiration for this idea. So just to continue with the setup, I'm going to assume radial symmetry, and I'm going to have these three cases. And if I remove noise from the problem, and then ask how long it takes to reach the hot lava, right? Then, just these three simple ODEs, and you can just easily solve these, right? So for constant drift, right? You get this, you get exponential for Ornstein-Uhlenbeck. It's the fastest one, and then 1 over r drift would be the slowest, right? And then you could solve, if you like, for the time it takes. So I'll just call that tau zero, zero meaning no noise. You get these different scalings. It takes a little bit longer for the constant drift towards the origin, and then 1 over r drift takes a little bit longer still compared to the Ornstein-Uhlenbeck. So I'm basically asking the question, if I have random time tau, what do trajectories look like when tau is much, much larger than tau naught? So how do they survive? So, and that's what I meant by, instead of looking at the statistics of the maximum first passage time, is I've done some work on studying rare events, and of course we care about the first passage time there, the first exit time from a potential well, say. And it's often in the asymptotics, the large deviation theory, to solve that problem, you find the optimal path, the most likely path to go from like an attractor to a saddle point or something. And it has often been the case in my own work that the pathways themselves are more biologically meaningful and interesting than the statistics of the time. So I'm interested in the pathways. This has nothing to do with the fact that Sean Lawley has done everything else already, and that this is like this tiny little corner of the space that James and I managed to find. Okay, so I like I said, I've used large deviation theory, which attempts to describe these paths using what you could call it optimal control theory or calculus of variations, whatever you want to call it. But in this new project, I wanted to take a different approach. And I want to look at stochastic paths that are conditioned on something. So let's say they're conditioned on a first passage time, occurring before or after some fixed parameter time. Okay, like we call it a horizon time, let's say. So how do I condition paths? And we saw this a little bit in June's talk, right, where we were talking about, where's June? He's right. We were talking about Brownian bridges, right? So this shows you something kind of like a Brownian bridge. So technically they would start and stop at the same spot, but you can condition the initial and the final position to be anywhere you want, right? The theory still holds. You get something called the Doob transform, and the idea is you sort of use Bayes theorem to derive a stochastic differential equation for the path, right? Which you're conditioning on starting at x at time 0, and then ending up somewhere on the sphere, right? X prime at some fixed parameter time t prime, right? So that's a time I control. And then this would tell you the pathway that it takes to get there, right? But the problem is, right, here's the hot lava sphere, right? This conditional path does not exclude the random walker from going into this region at any time between 0 and t prime. So it's not a first passage time, right? But the idea is similar to the Dubh transform, right? I have too many people coming up to me and saying, well, that's just the Dubh transform. Chris, no, I'm just kidding. Chris never said that to me. So how do you do this for first passage times? Well, another idea, if I can take a brief detour before I tell you the right answer, but this is not an unreasonable sort of approach to this problem. I've got a Langevin equation. So the increments of this process are Gaussian, right? So let's just condition these Gaussian increments on not crossing the boundary into the hot lava region, and then I've got a path that's conditioned on not going into the region, right? Okay, so I define this sort of infinitesimal drift, right? Which is an increment of length h, and then I divide by h, it's kind of like a derivative. And if I take this limit, then I'm going to get, minus f of x, my infinitesimal drift, right? That's a pretty standard calculation for these types of processes, where you're looking at an infinitesimal Gaussian increment. But instead I tried to do the conditional expectation, where what I want is, right, so I'm conditioning on staying away from the boundary here, and well, it shouldn't be a big surprise that the drift is really not going to be affected if we're away from the boundary. So it's just the standard infinitesimal drift. So what happens when you're near the drift? Well, I don't know. It's some kind of boundary condition, right? So maybe it's like Brownian motion with a reflecting boundary condition on the sphere of the lava when you condition the increments to stay away from it. Now, that is not the same thing as what I'm going to study, which is, let's look at the drift when we condition the first passage time to be larger than this is a parameter. T prime is a parameter I control, right? I'm just saying the first passage time has to be larger than this, right? If I condition on that, and then say I take the limit t prime to infinity, so I condition on the first passage time never occurring, right? What kind of process is that? It is not at all the same, right? It's kind of weird. I don't know. I don't know if I have a more intelligent answer to give you to why these two things give you very different answers. Probably something to do with filtrations. I don't know. Scott tried to tell me something, but I don't understand that stuff. So, all right. So here's the right way to do it. I think. Here's Carlin and Taylor wrote a very nice book, a second course on diffusion processes, I think is the name of the book. There are a lot of very neat advanced topics, and this is one of them. How do you condition a process on something? And they have, as an example, first passage time, right? So their proof of this is wrong. I mean, it's just, it is just wrong. But it's I think it's the kind of thing that maybe there's a corrected version of it somewhere in some paper that I don't know how to read. I haven't found it, but I feel like it's one of these things that people think is widely known, but it's hard to find a specific source, right? And this is also a very popular book too. So in any case, it does seem like you can correct the proof relatively easily. So the idea is, this is the condition process on tau being greater than some tau prime in the future, a horizon time, right? Here's the original process, and I'm sorry, I'm messing up my notation here. I should be capital F, right? But let's just assume 1D for now, and then it makes sense, okay? And the condition process actually satisfies a stochastic differential equation. So this is a a result very similar to the Doob H transform. In fact, you can put that in this language. And there's this additional drift term, right, which scales with the noise strength. And this is the gradient of the log of a probability. And it's the survival probability, right? And this gives you conditional paths. So here's my game plan. I'm going to derive this function u, and when I just simply plug it into this differential equation, I can qualitatively describe the behavior of the process. And I'm not going to compute first passage times or anything like that, or simulate anything. I'm just going to look at this function, okay? And it's going to tell me what the longest living mosquito does to survive for a long time. Okay? In fact, I'm going to take the limit t prime to infinity, so it's going to be like an immortal, forever surviving, Highlander mosquito, whatever. Right? So survival probability, that's what S is. It's just the probability that the first passage time is greater than some t. And it satisfies a backward Chapman-Kolmogorov equation. So this is a pretty well-defined PDE that I can solve in different nice geometries if I'm lucky, right? Otherwise, I might have to do some asymptotics. So those are the two approaches that I'm going to take. But today, I'm really only going to show you some results for some simple geometries where we can get some exact results. Okay.
A little s and big S are the same thing in that.
Oh, sorry, that's a typo. Thank you. That's a big S. And to make things really confusing, I'll do a Laplace transform in a minute. Okay. So yeah, I'm going to try to get the immortal walker. I'm going to take this kind of like a stationary limit, right, where I take t prime to infinity. And so I want this function. Now the problem is this is a difficult limit. The survival probability, it goes to 0, right, as t goes to infinity. So I've got this somewhat difficult limit to think about. Okay, so here is one example that we can get an exact result for constant drift in one dimension. And this has actually already been done. You can write down the survival probability exactly. It's just this combination of complementary error functions. And then you can take the derivative of this with respect to r and do the ratio. And it's not a really trivial limit, but then you can arrive at this fairly simple result for u. Okay, by itself, maybe that isn't such a meaningful result. Here's my original process, right? And I'm just going to plug in u into this, to the drift for the condition process. So mu is the strength of the drift, right? That points towards the origin, the constant drift. Now notice in the condition process, the drift is independent of mu. So, all right, that says something. If we have constant drift towards the origin, the mosquito that lives forever just pretends like there's no drift there at all. Okay, so there is a drift here, and this is the drift that keeps it out of the lava. It's like a 1 over r type of singular potential. So if we take y to be large enough, like this decays to 0, right? So far away from the lava, this is just a Brownian motion. So the mosquito is just pretending like there's no drift there at all. It's interesting. Okay. So this is actually the same result that you get if you just do Brownian motion. The same question with Brownian motion. There's this nice result that I also was reading around the same time, and that conditional first passage times are independent of the sign of the drift. So this is a deceptively similar problem, but it's not exactly the same thing. Conditional first passage time, as we all know, just says that if you condition on the first passage time being less than infinity, like it is going to happen in finite time, here's the first passage time. Because we're in these semi-infinite domains, so if the drift points away from the origin, then the probability of finding the lava isn't 1, right? So then you would need to condition on the first passage time. But if you do this, you get this curious result where the first passage time itself is independent of whether the drift points into or out of the origin. So I thought, okay, well, what happens if I just flip the sign of the drift? That analysis that I showed you assumes that mu is positive. And here, if I take mu negative, I get a different result. Now this is, you get minus mu again, okay? So now this is going to be positive, right? And you get a boundary layer near the hot lava. So this is like, again, the same asymptotic 1 over r kind of singular potential, but then it exponentially decays away from the boundary. So it's literally like a boundary layer, right? So this is what happens, right, to the weird case where the drift is pointing away from the origin, from the lava. So that I was hoping that this is some deeper result maybe that of this, to get this independence of drift, because we see that also in extreme first passage times when we look at the fastest one. Like you can have a drift and you look at that path, right, and how fast it finds the target when you make n very large is independent of the drift, right? All right, so does this generalize? But no, it doesn't. It's strange. Okay, I'll try and explain what's happening, or at least what I found, and it's a bit of a head scratcher, but okay. So if I look at the 1 over r drift, and the reason I did this, this is actually in Sid Renner's book. When you write down this problem, right, here's the component that you get the drift, and if you add in higher dimensions, then this is just shifting that constant, right? And so you can actually solve this problem in Laplace transform space, and so it's a tractable problem. All right, so that's what we could do. We can do the Laplace transform, and you get the result in terms of modified Bessel functions. All right, that's nice, but this is useless, at least on a simple level, because I want to take this limit, and there's no way to get that limit from the Laplace transform unless I were to do an asymptotic expansion in large time in the time domain using the Laplace transform, as Alan is just nodding his head like that's a simple thing to do, right? You've got some crazy contour, you've got branch points at, not just at the origin. You can't just get the asymptotics from the behavior around s equals 0, by the way. Since I haven't quite published this, I'm not going to tell you all the details of how I did it, but I can derive a problem and I can get this large time limit. And this is exact for the 1 over r drift and the immortal random walker. So this is the function u that modifies the drift. And here's the original process, right? So now I'm including the dimension. So in higher dimensions, right, because everything's radially symmetric, you just get an outward drift that is induced by the dimension, right? It's like the higher dimension sort of sucks up paths and draws them out away from the origin. That's a pretty standard result, right? And you can also understand that through like the radially symmetric Laplacian, right? You get a term that's like d minus 1 over r. Okay, so that's where this comes from, and I got minus mu over r. Right, and then the condition process is this. If I asymptotically expand it away from the boundary, it has that same exact 1 over r drift that repels it from the boundary. But if I look far away, what does the mosquito do when it gets far away from the lamp? It just flips the sign of the drift. So this is different than the constant drift case where it pretends like there's no drift there. Now it's pretending like the drift is pointed in the wrong direction, in the opposite direction. You even flip the drift on the dimensional part of the drift. And this, I think, is a reasonably general result because I've also derived this for the Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process, and I've also done it in the weak noise with weak noise singular perturbation theory. You get, a very confused mosquito that just goes against the standard flow of things. It does the opposite of whatever the mosquitoes around it are doing, right? So that's how to live an extraordinary life where you live forever, I guess. So I have, like I said, results for the OU process, which are reasonably exact, very close to exact, and weak noise singular perturbation theory. And during my sabbatical, Scott and I cooked up some more rigorous questions that we might gain insight to these processes with. And I guess what I want to drive home is that this is kind of an interesting avenue into studying first passage time problems, looking at these conditional paths. The downside is you have to solve a reasonably difficult problem, which is the entire survival probability, right? Normally we look at like stationary problems like the first passage time, but I do think I've got a stationary equation which we can gain insight into these. So yeah, this is my funding support. It's not the NSF, like the Canadian NSF. Insert. Thanks.
Questions, Sid?
Well, I was just curious if you are aware of work of Baruch Mearson, who's done some very beautiful work on like looking at, I guess he uses what it calls geometrical optics. So he looks at the slowest of an ensemble of walkers or the fastest, and that there's some mapping that he's done. I don't know any of the details, but it seems like it's very similar.
I'll have to look into it. I see that name all the time.
Yeah.
Probably I have at least a dozen papers.
Yeah.
Right, but I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he has something to say about things like the slowest of and the fastest and the ensemble of random walkers that are the slowest and the fastest.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Does the transform also affect the diffusion term as well? Because
No, it doesn't. Yeah. That's
Then-
kind of a cool part.
the probability it can escape to the lava, right? With the positive drift. So
Not with a singular drift.
singular.
Yeah, it blows up to infinity. That's what.
It doesn't.
Yeah, he's right. So it's a Gaussian increment, technically, like Sean was just saying. The probability is positive everywhere. Right? So it's got to be able to go over to the boundary, even if that's an infinitesimally small probability. But it's the fact that the drift blows up to infinity, like 1 over r, like 1 over the distance from the boundary. So these two like perfectly balance each other. So I think the probability is positive to go any distance, non-zero distance from the boundary.
Thank you.
I'll claim that.
Like I don't have a sense for whether what you talked about today would apply if you have, say, like concentric spheres with this longest and concentric spheres of hot lava with the longest living mosquito just kind of stay radially sort of like in between the two spheres.
That's a great question. That's like a more complicated problem, boundary condition wise. Excellent question. I don't know the answer. I haven't only tackled these easier ones so far, right? Yeah, but I mean, in one dimension, that would even be very interesting, I think. Yeah, good question.
So there's this important quantity. It's not quite the gradient of the log of the survivability, but of the density. It's called the score, and it comes up.
Yeah, it's the same idea. Yeah,
Same idea.
they use these in
Modeling.
diffusion models. They're huge in right now in these generative probability flow models. Yeah. So I like 2 branches of my research, and they both like hit this at the same time. That's a good observation. Yeah, so when you condition and you have these time-dependent processes, you get these modified drifts, right? Gradient of some probability, the log of some probability.